Is the biologists' consensus on when human life begins really a bulletproof paper? Well, let's find out. This is The Bullet.
There's no consensus among the scientific community.
There is, Dr. Phil. 96% of scientists say that life begins at fertilization.
Why exactly do you think a first trimester fetus has moral value?
Because whether you consider it a potential human life or a full-on human life, it has more value than just a cluster of cells. If left to its natural processes, it will grow into a baby. Right? The problem is anytime you draw any line other than the inception of the child, you end up drawing a false line that can also be applied to people who are adults.
The pro-abortion person here will respond with a few different moves. The first is to try to dehumanize the unborn, of course. He'll claim that the unborn child is not a human person and thus does not have the same moral standing and cannot make the same moral claims for itself that a, quote, real person can make. Now, the idea that an unborn child isn't human, which is something that you do hear from pro-aborts, even supposedly educated ones, is such a silly, absurd, anti-scientific notion that I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. It's simply a scientific fact that the being in the womb is indeed a being, a living being, and it is a member of the human species. Now, we know that because all living things have to be a member of some species or another. If an unborn child isn't human, then what species is it?
If the unborn are not human beings, then getting an abortion is a little more serious than going to the dentist to have a tooth pulled. Since we would not outlaw tooth extractions in order to reduce the number of them that occur, we should not outlaw abortion simply to reduce the number of abortions that occur. If, that is, the unborn are not human beings. But if the unborn are human beings, then abortion can't be justified, any more than killing a 2-year-old could be justified. If we wouldn't kill 2-year-olds because they were unwanted, and if the unborn are as human as a 2-year-old, then it follows that we should not kill unborn children.
Let us say an embryo does not meet the criteria necessary to be considered an individual human being, with the inherent rights under whatever law applies in the location where it is situated. Why does that mean it has no legal consideration at all? I mean, plenty of things that are not an individual human being have legal protections of some kind, even if not the level of an individual human being. I would have to disagree that the whole issue hinges on the scientific categorization, that simply by meeting the criteria of a human organism, it then has the right to appropriate a woman's body for 9 months. The fact is that abortion is more involved than having a tooth pulled, and we do try to cut down on the number of teeth that are pulled. Having abortions in later stages of gestation is far from ideal. There are reasons to encourage dental health, and there are reasons to oppose people who want to make dental surgeries illegal. It doesn't simply follow that because a tooth is not a person, that losing teeth is great.
Number one, what is the heart of the case for pro-life? What's the key question?
Really simple. Is the unborn child, whether embryo or fetus or just before birth, a full human person with legal right to life and protectability?
Okay.
Because if he or she is not, then it's not hard to understand why a woman's right over her own body would trump that.
There's two different questions at stake here. The first is, at what point does a fertilized egg become a person? And there is no scientific consensus on this. There is no scientific definition of what that could possibly be.
You're slipping, though, from human to a person. You're trying to define the human not as a physically, objectively existing thing, but as a social being, which, of course, no one in a womb can be. So presumably you're not a person until the moment you're born, by that definition, but you're still a human.
Well,
they seek to distract and confuse and conflate this discussion when really it's just really simple. The reason why I asked biologists is I wanted an objective understanding of whether or not this fetus is a human or a non-human. You know, Is it akin to my skin cells or my liver cells, that they are human in terms of the adjective, or are they human in terms of the noun, where, you know, obviously your skin cells are qualitatively different from another human. That other human is an actual human organism. It is a human, the noun. It is not only human, the adjective.
Human as an adjective or human as a noun. I think I've already mentioned how reproductive cells are already genetically different from somatic cells. Peter Hitchens is correct in a sense that the next categorical change after fetus is at birth, when it ceases to be a fetus. The word fetus itself is just a name for an embryo that has met a natural history identification criteria. In medical terms, the word fetus refers to an embryo that has developed for more than 8 weeks past fertilization. Consider a blood cell. Assuming it is alive, then it has a life that belongs to it. Its life began when it was created. But does a blood cell really own its own life? Or does its life belong to the organism that it's part of? In a sense, it owns its life, and in another sense, it doesn't.
Now, as for living, is it living? Well, there are only 3 states of being that a physical entity can be. And I think this holds true for the most part, except maybe at the quantum level. That would be most things are either alive, dead, or inanimate. Now, is the unborn baby inanimate? No. Inanimate objects don't grow, they don't develop, they don't move on their own, they don't consume food. You know, this podium right here is inanimate. It will never be anything other than this. It will decay and fall apart. You could cut it into pieces and build it into something else, but it's never on its own going to grow into something else because it's inanimate. Is the unborn child dead? Well, no, we know it's not dead, because if it was dead, then we wouldn't need the abortion. So that leaves only living. Okay, so the baby is a living human. We've established that. We've settled that argument already. That's good.
An ovum doesn't care about your feelings. It will attempt to get fertilized, and once it has done that, it will attempt to implant. And it's not particularly bothered in who or what. At what point does an ovum own its own life? When she says so. And, well, yes, maybe. Like she can give away ownership of her blood cells to someone else. But obviously with a process that ends with the creation of a new human being, there has to be a point at which it is no longer voluntary that you allow it life.
And basically they had received such a pushback from many of the biologists who, let's just say, their ideological biases were activated when they were asked this question, this scientific, really simplistic question. And that was what was interesting, how many biologists, some would say, this is such an elementary question. We all know this answer. We've known it since the 1800s. You've practically wasted my time in even asking it. And then the other side makes it out to be that I'm pushing some agenda.
And this question is so elementary that we didn't even bother to think about it before giving an answer. The discovery of conception was a scientific breakthrough in the 19th century. Is a sperm a seed? Is fertilization life beginning?
Because the answer to the question, can I kill this, depends almost entirely on the identity of the thing being killed. Every honest person involved in the abortion debate admits something is killed during an abortion. If it is mere tissue, then abortion is no more immoral than clipping a toenail.
Yeah. And I think that's how we've progressed, or, rather devolved. I think our reasoning on it, if you look at most pro-choice arguments, they really don't stand up to even the next level of argumentation. So like you said, I mean, even consider something like, I don't think I have a right to tell somebody what to do with their body. Do you feel that same way when it comes to slavery, when it comes to other issues, that it should just be a matter of, if you don't want to have an abortion, don't have one.
Right.
Versus, well, if you don't want to own slaves, don't
own slaves.
Well, no, we need laws against that because there's human conduct that we need to restrict.
Right.
Because it's a form of evil, it's destructive, however you want to call it.
Well, the irony there being that slavery literally was telling someone what to do with their body. And the next level of argument is that an embryo should be allowed to grow inside someone against their wishes.
Can't deny are true.
So, I mean, that's kind of the thrust of the research, is that it's only through dehumanization that we're able to justify what is. And this data kind of shocks most people, but right now, over 56 million humans are killed through abortion each year. That's the same number of deaths from all causes combined. Obesity, old age, heart disease, AIDS, cancer. 56 million humans die a year from all causes, and then 56 million humans are killed in abortion. And that means 1 billion humans have been killed since Y2K, since the year 2000.
Well, I would never have guessed that that would have been the thrust of the research. But let me just flatten this argument about numbers. If we are to believe this premise that a human being begins at conception, then the main cause of death is not abortion. The number of miscarriages is comparable to the number of abortions. But one thing dwarfs both of those statistics: the number of fertilized eggs that fail to implant. Now here's Bill Nye attempting to make that point.
Many, 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 many more hundreds of eggs are fertilized than become humans. Eggs get fertilized, and by that I mean sperm get accepted by ova a lot. But that's not all you need. You have to attach to the uterine wall, the inside of a womb, a woman's womb.
Well, don't get me wrong, Bill Nye is the uber godfather of science, but many hundreds of eggs getting fertilized, that is quite an adventurous Saturday night out, even by my promiscuous standards. If he is talking about amphibians, then the female lays a bunch of eggs, and later on the male goes to town on that whole batch of eggs. Metaphorically, if you see what I mean. Anyway, to clarify the situation, human beings on average need to fertilize 4 or 5 eggs before one successfully implants. Which means for every pregnancy there have been maybe 4 failed implantations. Well, the implication of this is that if we were to accept that from conception onwards that we are dealing with a person with the full value of a person, then merely to attempt to get pregnant, you are accepting the likely death of 4 people to achieve that. Given the number of pregnancies is something like 6 or 7 times more frequent than abortion, then the number of failed implantations is exponentially greater than the number of abortions. Thus, the claim that abortion outstrips every other form of death is false.
If you want to go all the way to the moment of conception, then that means that a woman who just whatever kind of miscarries in the first, second, or third week and doesn't realize it, that is the same as like, oops, somebody dropped their child down the stairs and they died.
No, that is absolutely not the same. Do you understand science and what happens in a miscarriage? An unattended miscarriage?
Unattended. That's why I'm saying we should lock them up after they have sex.
I don't think your argument doesn't make any sense.
My argument makes perfect sense.
No,
if you truly
lock
believe,
a woman up,
it's
actually very
heinous.
It might be more likely to
I
miscarry because of
understand
the
it's really,
stress.
I know it
Which
hurts
is why I
because
don't
it
think we
obviously
should jail
demonstrates
pregnant
another
women,
huge
quite
flaw.
frankly.
If you believe
Can I
that the
finish?
moment of,
Can
no,
I-
you can't right now. If you believe that at the moment of conception you've created a unique human being, then that means that right now you should be in tears because at every moment women that are engaged, in fact, you could probably make the argument that sex without the intention of immediately going to a hospital is probably immoral because you're engaging in some activity that might result in the death of a child in 2 or 3 or 4 weeks because you don't know if you're going to have a miscarriage.
Destiny scene there, arguing with Kristen Hawkins, raising a point about the fragility of an early pregnancy, making the point that if this claim about life beginning at conception is true, then shouldn't we be on tenterhooks because of the gravity and likelihood of a child's death occurring? Well, the consequence being that immediately after sex there should be some strange handmaid's tale nanny following you around, making sure you don't do anything that might endanger the potential embryo.
What about person, though? Well, this is a little bit more interesting because the pro-abortion individual, if he has any degree of sophistication, will probably concede that a, quote, fetus, or undocumented infant, as I like to call them, he'll concede that it's a living human, but he'll say, okay, fine, it's a living human, you're right about that, but it's not a person. And he'll say that it's not a person because it's still developing and it is entirely dependent on its mother for survival, and this, he will say, means that it lacks moral standing. But this view that personhood is acquired by degree and that it's forfeit if you are entirely dependent on someone else for survival clearly implicates more than just the unborn. It would seem that the sick, the infirm, the disabled, the elderly would all get caught up in this net. If we're not willing to do that, if we're not willing to look at an infant child at, let's say, 3 months out of the womb, or an elderly person in a nursing home, or a disabled person in a wheelchair, if we're not willing to look at them and say that, well, you're kind of not as much of a person as me, you're a little bit less people-y than me. If we're not willing to do that, if we're not willing to say that personhood is attained by degree contingent upon factors like self-sufficiency, then we are left with this idea that personhood is inherent.
Matt Walsh there talking about pro-choice advocates. I am obviously lacking the sophistication to concede to the pro-life appeal to authority. Well, dependency is an issue, but it's not the main or fundamental issue. The unborn is inside the internal reproductive organs of a person. And by definition, that is where a living gestating embryo is. Sure, if the issue was simply dependency, then it would implicate everyone and everything with dependency. But abortion is the termination of a pregnancy. It is impossible to have an abortion of a born person. And the justification of abortion will obviously involve pregnancy and not simply random facts about an embryo. It's not an embryo in a lab where we must decide if it is ethical to terminate it. A pregnancy occurs inside a person, and that is the whole reason, the scenario, and why abortion exists. It doesn't simply depend upon whether or not an embryo has inherent value. If an embryo was so inherently valuable, then why would her decisions matter at all? Why would we deem her quality of life a factor? Why should she have a say in what her body is used for?
Human rights. You may think you've always had yours, but you would be wrong. So how did you get your human rights? From the magical birth canal, of course.
Okay, let me just state this alternate scientific view before I wrap this up. It ceases to be an embryo when you give birth to it. Its anatomy changes. It discards organs that were once necessary in its previous anatomical location. All the nutrient processing that was previously done by the parent must now be done by the infant's own body. Its location changes. Sure, but this is an anatomical location. I guess if the woman slides up the table as the baby emerges, then its geographic location could remain the same. Now, organs that have never functioned before must successfully accomplish their task independently, and it can be argued that this is the point it becomes an individual member of its species.
So what exactly happens in the birth canal that causes this magical transformation? No one knows. But popular scientific theories include fairies, aliens, or of course, a mini Big Bang. I think it's fairies. Science, logic, magic.
It's okay to kill it. So you're saying my vagina is magical. So something happens.
No, first of all, as a child born by C-section, I'm very offended. Okay,
but
we're humans too.
That's the position
Number one,
you're
no,
taking.
Hold on.
Is it something magical happens during birth?
The vagina magic guy is not in the room right now. I didn't give any qualification about birth being the magical time that made somebody a human. I've never said that ever. So I have no idea what position you're attacking there.
Now, I used to work in a bar where a stripper called Sticky Vicky would do a magic show that included pulling various objects out of a hat. Except it wasn't a hat that she pulled these objects out of. And I guess Vicky could be described as the vagina magic woman. Now, my role in this was audio related. I would simply play her background music tape through the PA while she performed. As the vagina magic guy, I don't know if I would get many volunteers to make that kind of video. However, it is certainly one way of making a living that I haven't tried yet. Well, that was quite a lot to unpack. And if there were any factual errors, be sure to rant at me in caps, definitely, down in the comments. And that's about all from the Vagina Magic Guy for this video. Maybe like and subscribe, I don't know, because I might make another thing sometime.
What do the other 4% believe?
Do you know what the difference is between a baby and a fetus?
So this is a really common question that we get on college campuses and online. The word fetus is Latin.
Whatever you do, don't tell us the truth.
Literally, all that it means is small person.
But do you know what the Latin word fetus means?
I don't care. I'm not Latin.
It means young one.
I don't think that's what she was asking. I think she means biologically.
When people use the words science says, you know they've got an agenda, because science doesn't say anything.
Science also tells us.
And science tells us.
Science tells us. It's simply a scientific fact.
So it is a scientific fact.
Well, actually, it's not.
Well, when do you say human life begins then?
It doesn't matter what I think. I don't care what I think. What I'm saying is the scientific community does not have a consensus about when life begins.
It's simply inaccurate. It's simply inaccurate.
That's not true.